All right, so new battery standards for caravans, or what we call connectable installations in the electrical space. So, first of all, AS 3001 is not new. AS 3001 has been around since standards within Australia have been provided for electricians to be able to have a place to go so that the electrical space is built within a minimum of a standard. That can be a house, that can be a boat, in this application, a caravan. A connectable installation is anything that has the ability to be connected via a portable lead. So a caravan is a connectable installation, a motorhome, your full drive canopy, if you've got a 15 amp appliance inlet on the side of it, is a connectable installation, much to the disagreement of some people in the space. As soon as you have the ability to plug in a portable, an extension lead into the side of something, that becomes connectable, and it needs to comply to this particular standard. AS 3001 was revised into two parts in November of 2022. During that period of time, post November 2022, we had a grace period of 12 months to bring ourselves up to speed with the standard and start complying by November 18, 2023. Now, as we probably are all aware, if you own a caravan, there's a lot of discussion around the standard and what it means and what it needs to look like from a whole bunch of things in social media and probably in caravan parks and camping spaces around the place. But this particular video is going to cover off what we see are the key points to helping people understand a little bit better the requirements of the revision of AS 3001 Part 2 2022. I'm not going to go into any detail about the 240 volt side of things because as far as I'm concerned, you shouldn't be touching 240 volt anyway unless you are a licensed electrician. What I am going to cover off are key points in the DC side of things, which are quite often up for question. We get lots of questions about them. I answer lots of questions about them on social media, on different forums that I'm involved in. And new customers quite often ask us the questions as well. So this is just hopefully a bit of an overview as to what we see are the most important points. First point is PV wiring, solar wiring, photovoltaic wiring, etc., etc. So in AS 3001, the standard now requires you to run in double insulated cable that's appropriate for solar installation, mechanically protect it, install IP rated connectors on the end of the runs, and also penetrations through the roof need to be IP rated as well. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but traditionally in caravan installations, the PV wiring was done exactly the same as any other DC wiring in the caravan. So, you know, your radio, for example, might have two single cables running to it, or, you know, speaker wire running through the roof. That was quite often the same way that solar cabling was run. So now the requirement is that each string, and we'll get to what a string means in a minute, each string is double insulated, mechanically protected. So double insulated means that there is a single copper core with a sheath around the outside of it, which is one insulation, and then another sheath, another separate sheath around that, making that two insulation, double insulation around the outside of the cable. And then a mechanical protection is a conduit, which then wraps all of that up. So that then becomes mechanically protected. And there's a whole bunch of other things about clipping it and making sure that it's safe and not going to get damaged and all those sorts of things, which are part of the standard as well. So that's the first thing. Circuit protection on those strings. Now, a string is, in accordance with the standard, is one panel in parallel, or two panels in parallel. So each of those panels in parallel is a string, or two panels in series is a string. So each string needs to be fused if you have 3 or more strings in a circuit. That's the minimum standard. Now, when we do our installations, we're fusing all the strings anyway. But you know, the minimum requirement of the standard is that anything more than 3 strings. So if you, for example, have 3 panels on your roof in parallel, then they all need to be individually fused. And the reason for that is because there is a potential for one of the panels in that circuit to fail, and the other 2 feed through that panel as circulating current and cause a fire. So the fuse is there to protect that panel from catching fire under fault conditions. So they're the reasons why we need that installed. On top of that, the circuit, which could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 strings, depending upon your design, needs to be isolated as well before it goes to the charge controller. So in our applications and our installations, and we can have a look down here, we have individual circuit protection for each panel. So this particular circuit has 4 solar panels installed on it. And then we also have an isolator for that particular. So the solar panels come down from the roof through our fuse, out of the fuse into our isolator, across to our charge controller. So from the requirement of the standard, we've met the standard and we've increased the standard on that particular part of the installation as well. Battery protection. So this one isn't talked about a lot, but it is quite important to make sure that your battery installation meets the standard and obviously everything else that comes along with that with regards to insurance and the like. First of all, the battery needs to meet IEC 62619. That's a completely separate standard, and there are differing views on what that actually means, but the battery manufacturer that you've purchased the battery from should be able to provide you with a certificate which states the battery is compliant with 62619. That's the first thing. The second thing is the BMS needs to continuously monitor. Now, continuously means permanently connected to, now not be switched off, not have the ability to be turned off. Over voltage and under voltage, over temperature and under temperature, and over current. So those 5 things need to be able to be monitored by the BMS. Now, most battery manufacturers that you go to and purchase a battery will have a BMS inbuilt into the battery. There are some manufacturers that are still building batteries that have an external BMS. Either way, that BMS needs to be installed within 600 mil of the battery. So when you buy a battery in a container, off-the-shelf battery, that complies as long as it meets all those standards. If you buy one that has an external BMS, that BMS needs to be installed within 600 mil of the battery. The third thing with regards to battery protection is it needs to have a battery monitor. Now, this is a really important part of the installation in my view, because it takes away most of the issues associated with drop-in batteries. So There are some manufacturers of batteries out there which are promoting their battery as being able to be connected to any charger without issue. They can't do that anymore because you now need to have a battery monitor. Now, battery monitor, in accordance with the standard, needs to be able to monitor voltage and state of charge. If you have a battery system that's an AGM battery system and you change that over to lithium and you leave your chargers as AGM chargers, you do not have a compliant system because you do not have a battery monitor in that system that is compliant to that lithium battery. So that's the first thing. Let's talk about battery location. This one here is probably the one out of everything that has caused the most conjecture, misunderstanding, questions, all the things, including myself. I went through a stage when I first read the revision of the standard, thinking about how we were going to be able to comply to this. Now, the standard has said that the battery needs to be installed outside of the habitable space. Now, without going into, what that actually means and how we come to work out what that actually means, is it then goes on to say the battery needs to be enclosed and vented externally. Enclosed, vented externally. So what that can mean is different things to different people, but the way we have interpreted that is that we are installing our batteries now inside enclosures. Those enclosures are fully sealed off from the inside of the van and they are externally vented outside. So we run a filter medium outside the van so that we can then have the battery enclosure vented externally, and we fully seal off the battery from the space. So in this particular van, what I've done in here is I've created an enclosure which is completely sealed off from the space. So as you can see, there's a battery inside this box. You can see the cables coming into the box. Everything is completely sealed off from the outside of the space. Sorry, from the internal space. And we also have a vent which vents the battery compartment externally outside the van. The other examples of where a battery could be installed, if you take this principle and apply it to an underbed solution, same thing, as long as it's enclosed and vented externally. Some caravans come with generator boxes at the rear of the van or the front of the van. That's a great place for a battery because that absolutely, as long as it's vented, it complies. Just need to think about all the other installation requirements for that, volt drop, etc., etc. Tunnel boots are also being used for installing batteries into. So you can actually install your battery inside the tunnel boot and create a safe space in there as well and vent that. That's fine. That's outside the habitable space. So there are a few variants of locations that you can install these batteries. And sorry, to clarify, this is actually for lithium ion batteries. And a lithium ion battery is any variant of lithium. So in our application, this is a lithium iron phosphate battery, but not that I'm suggesting that you would ever do this, but you could have any of the other chemistries of batteries installed as a deep cycle battery in your Caravan. Not recommended, but they still need to comply with this standard. Okay, so just to summarize the battery location needs to be sealed off from the habitable space and externally vented. They are the two major things that need to be done for a lithium ion battery. Sealed away from the habitable space, externally vented. You need to add some labeling in, which, you know, the labeling that you require is actually determined by how you've installed it. So there's not one size fits all kind of solution for the labeling that you need. However, the standard does give you an example of what it could say to meet the requirement. So you can, as long as you've designed a label which complies in principle to what you're trying to say for your particular installation, then that's okay. It's a warning label, basically. There are other warning labels which are required as part of the standard as well. But predominantly for this one, it's for us in this particular application, we've said that that compartment cannot be opened. You know, as part of the standard, it's dangerous to open those. Okay, a couple of other things that probably just need to be clarified with regards to the standard. Who needs to comply? First of all, anyone needs to comply. If you are a DIY installer, you need to comply, because your insurance company may not pay out if something goes wrong. If you aren't compliant, you need to be able to prove that you're compliant. Obviously, installers, so off-grid installers, and that can generally be what we find in this particular industry anyway, is parts accessory fitters or auto sparkies also need to comply, even though the standard is for has been written for electricians and electrical contractors. It doesn't matter. It's still, you need to be compliant if you want to make sure that you're ticking all the boxes from an insurance perspective. When do you need to comply is the next question. So I'll give you a couple of examples of when you need to comply. If you have a Caravan that has AGMs installed and you want to take it to lithium, that's an alteration and you need to comply. If you have a lithium battery already in your Caravan that's, let's say, 100 amp hour, and you want to increase that size to 400 amp hour, that's an alteration and you need to comply. When don't you need to comply? If you've got a 200 amp hour battery and it requires replacement, and you are only going to replace it with another 200 amp hour battery of equal chemistry and size, that's not an alteration, so you don't need to comply. You can just take that old battery out and you can put the new one in. Everything stays the same, no problems. Do you need to comply if you want to add additional solar to the roof of your Caravan? Yes. The solar installation that's being done at the time will need to comply to AS 3000 Part 2 2022. Do you need to bring up to standard all the rest of the installation? No, you don't. However, it would be a good idea to do it at the same time for all the reasons we've talked about. So there's some good examples of when you need to comply and when you don't necessarily need to comply. Is it a good idea to comply? Yes, it is a good idea to comply. The standard has been fairly well written from the perspective of bringing up the level of installation inside Caravans. Unfortunately, with Caravans, the installation practices over the years have been fairly substandard in relation to how we would expect people that are not from this industry would expect to see an electrical installation done. They are very substandard. So bringing the level of installation up in a Caravan is not only going to make it more reliable, it's going to make it safer for the owner, and it's going to be easier for us as installers and maintainers to maintain the installation. Labeling is a fantastic thing. It tells us where items have been installed throughout the van, and generally that's just part of an electrical installation. We need to know how things are installed. So just some questions that we get asked quite a bit. One of them is, for example, I've got a Caravan with 200 amp hour of lithium and I want to take it from the chassis and bring it inside. Do I need to comply? Yes, you do. That's an alteration. So anytime you modify your system that makes it different from how it was previously, then yes, that's an alteration. That needs to comply. So even though predominantly you could potentially get away with exactly the same components, that's rewiring the system, it will need to comply. We've also had some questions in relation to doing a modification of a van and leaving the battery boxes on the side of the van so that you don't need to comply with the standard. You do need to comply with the standard. The standard still needs to be complied to for all the reasons of installation practices. The only thing you wouldn't necessarily need to comply to is battery location. It's not recommended to install them down there. Not a lot of battery manufacturers will suggest that down there on the chassis is a great place for their batteries, but it then doesn't need to comply to the habitable space external, vented externally, because it is outside the van already. All right, so that's quite a lot of information for this video. Hopefully it's been informative. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks, guys.